In the drought-stricken town of Copper Ridge, Arizona Territory, 1887, a skeletal Mustang Foal collapses in the main street's dust, abandoned and dying. The townspeople, hardened by years of conflict with Apache raids, want nothing to do with the wild horse. But when Aiyana, a weathered Apache tracker who occasionally trades with the town, kneels beside the suffering creature, his unexpected act of compassion will challenge everything the town believes about their enemy and reveal a connection between the foal, a long-lost child, and a tragedy that has haunted both cultures for years. What begins as a simple act of mercy becomes a journey of healing that will transform bitter enemies into unlikely family, proving that love can bridge even the deepest divides. The Arizona sun beat mercilessly on Copper Ridge's dusty main street, turning the packed earth into a furnace that shimmered with heat waves. Sheriff Tom Bradley wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he stepped out of his office, the silver star on his vest catching the brutal afternoon light. At 62, he'd seen enough summers in this God-forsaken territory to know that this drought was different, meaner, more persistent than any in recent memory. The town lay quiet under the oppressive heat. Mrs. General Store had its windows shuttered tight, and even the saloon doors hung motionless in the still air. Only a few hardy souls braved the streets, old Pete hobbling toward the water trough with his ancient mule, and young Billy Carver sweeping the porch of his father's blacksmith shop with the mechanical movements of someone trying to stay busy. It was Billy who first spotted the movement at the far end of the street. "Sheriff," the 15-year-old's voice cracked as he pointed toward the ridge beyond town. "Something's coming down the hill." Tom shielded his eyes against the glare and squinted. A dark shape moved unsteadily down the rocky slope, stumbling and weaving like a drunk on Saturday night. But as it drew closer, the sheriff's heart sank. It wasn't a person at all. The Mustang Foal couldn't have been more than 6 months old, but it looked ancient in its suffering. Its ribs showed like fence slats through hide that hung loose and patchy, Mangy having claimed great sections of its coat. The little horse's head hung so low it nearly dragged in the dust, and each step seemed to require tremendous effort. "Lord have mercy," whispered Miss Henderson, who had emerged from her store to see what Billy was hollering about. Her hand flew to her throat as the foal stumbled into the main street, its legs shaking like saplings in a windstorm. More townspeople began to gather. Drawn by the pitiful sight, Doc Morrison, the town physician, stepped out of his office across the street, his medical bag in hand, though he knew there was nothing in it for a dying horse. Martha Wilkins, the schoolteacher, covered her mouth in horror. Even hardened cowboys from the nearby ranches began to congregate, their usual bravado replaced by uncomfortable silence. The foal made it perhaps 50 yards into town before its legs finally gave out. It collapsed in a cloud of dust right in front of the saloon, its flanks heaving with labored breaths. One of its eyes was crusted shut with infection, and the other stared dully at nothing, already glazing with the approach of death. "Poor little thing," Martha whispered, tears gathering in her kind eyes. "It's just a baby." "Wild horses," spat Jake Morrison, Doc's younger brother, and one of the town's more vocal citizens. "Probably diseased. Could spread whatever it's got to our lives." He hawked and spat in the dust, his weathered face hard with suspicion. Best thing would be to put it out of its misery quick. Several men nodded in agreement. These were practical people, shaped by years of harsh frontier life. They'd learned to make difficult decisions without sentiment, and a dying wild horse was just another problem to be solved efficiently. Sheriff Bradley approached the collapsed foal slowly, his boots crunching in the dry earth. The little creature's breathing was so shallow it was barely perceptible, and flies had already begun to gather around its infected wounds. Tom had put down plenty of animals in his time. It was part of frontier life, but something about this particular creature tugged at him in a way he couldn't quite name. "Billy, go fetch my rifle," he said quietly, his voice heavy with resignation. "No sense letting it suffer." The young man nodded and started toward the sheriff's office, but his steps were reluctant. Like everyone else, He could see the foal was beyond saving, but that didn't make the task any easier to watch. As Billy reached the office door, a new voice cut through the afternoon air. "Wait." The word was spoken quietly, but it carried with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Every head in the street turned toward the source. A figure standing in the shadow of the bank building, so still he might have been carved from the wood itself. Aiyana stepped into the sunlight, and a collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. He was Apache, that much was immediately clear from his features, his dress, and the way he carried himself with the fluid grace of someone equally at home in wilderness and settlement. Perhaps 40 years old, his face was weathered by sun and wind, marked by lines that spoke of both hardship and laughter. His long black hair was streaked with early silver and hung in traditional braids, adorned with small beads and feathers. He wore a mix of native and white man's clothing, buckskin leggings and moccasins, but also a cotton shirt that had seen better days and a wide-brimmed hat that he'd likely traded for. The townspeople instinctively drew back as he walked forward, not from immediate fear. Aiyana had been trading with Copper Ridge for over 2 years, but from the ingrained wariness that existed between their peoples. The Apache Wars were still fresh in everyone's memory, and though this particular Apache had proven trustworthy in business dealings, old habits died hard. "Aiyana," Sheriff Bradley acknowledged with a careful nod. He kept his hand near his gun, not from any specific threat, but because that's how these encounters always went. Respectful, but cautious. "Didn't see you come into town." "I have been here since dawn," the Apache replied, his English careful and precise, learned through years of necessary interaction with white settlements. "Trading with Henderson. Saw the little one coming down the mountain." His dark eyes shifted to the collapsed foal, and something in his expression softened. "She has traveled far." "She?" Doc Morrison stepped forward, genuinely curious despite the tension. "How can you tell?" Aiyana approached the foal slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, though whether that was for the horse's benefit or the townspeople's was unclear. He knelt in the dust beside the dying creature, seemingly oblivious to the dirt staining his clothes. "The way she holds her head, even in sickness," he said softly, gently placing a weathered hand near the foal's muzzle without quite touching. "The shape of her ears. She is female, perhaps 6 moons old." He paused, studying the small horse more closely. "And she is not wild." "What do you mean, not wild?" Jake Morrison demanded, suspicion coloring his voice. "Look at her. She's mangy as a coyote and skinny as a rail. That's a wild Mustang if I ever seen one." Aiyana shook his head slowly, his fingers now barely grazing the foal's matted coat. "Look at her hooves," he said. "See how they are shaped. This is from walking on hard ground, not rocky mountain trails. And here," he indicated a barely visible mark on the foal's neck. "She wore a halter once. Someone owned her, cared for her." The townspeople exchanged glances. If the Apache was right, this changed things. A wild horse, dying in their street was one thing. Unpleasant but not their responsibility. But a domestic animal, someone's property, lost and suffering, well, whose is she then? Billy asked, having returned with the rifle but now holding it uncertainly. Aiyana continued his examination, his touch gentle but thorough. The foal's eye tracked weakly to his face, and for a moment something passed between them, a recognition that transcended species. "She came from the north," he said finally. "From the high country, where the grass grows thick in spring." His voice grew troubled. "But there are no ranches there now. Not since the soldiers came 3 summers ago." An uncomfortable silence settled over the crowd. Everyone knew what he was referring to, though none spoke of it directly. 3 years ago, a cavalry unit had been sent to clear out what they called hostile Apache settlements in the northern mountains. The operation had been thorough and brutal, and when it was over, the high meadows that had once supported both Apache communities and scattered homesteads had been left empty. "So she's been on her own all this time?" Martha Wilkins asked, her voice thick with sympathy. "Poor little thing. She's been trying to find her way home." Aiyana nodded gravely. I think she was born up there, maybe to a mare owned by a... He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. By people who lived in that place before the trouble. When they had to leave or couldn't take her, she has been searching ever since. The foal's breathing grew more labored, and a soft whimper escaped her. The sound cut through the crowd like a knife, and even the hardest men felt something stir in their chests. She's dying, Doc Morrison said unnecessarily. Look at her. She's got the mange, probably worms, and she's starved near to death. Even if we wanted to help, I don't know what we could do. Put her out of her misery, Jake repeated, but with less conviction than before. It's the kind thing to do. Aiyana looked up from the foal, his dark eyes moving from face to face in the crowd. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. In my people's way, he said, when a young one is lost and suffering, we do not give up while breath still moves in the body. This little horse has fought for 3 years to stay alive, to find her way home. She has earned the right to have someone fight for her. You can't seriously think she can be saved, Sheriff Bradley said, though his tone was gentler than it might have been. Look at her, Aiyana. She's more dead than alive. The Apache was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting lightly on the foal's neck. When he finally spoke, there was something in his voice that none of them had heard before. A deep sadness mixed with determination. I had a daughter once, he said softly. She would be about the age this horse was when the world changed, for both of them. My daughter, she was taken in the same troubles that scattered the people from the high country. He looked down at the foal, and his voice grew even quieter. I could not save her. But perhaps... He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The meaning hung in the air, heavy as the summer heat. Mrs. Henderson was the first to step forward. Despite her usual wariness around the Apache trader, she found herself moved by the pain in his voice. What would you need, she asked, practically. I mean, if you were going to try to help her. Aiyana looked up, surprise flickering across his features. He had expected resistance, not offers of assistance. Water first, he said. Clean water, slowly given. And a place out of the sun where she can rest without the dust. The livery stable, Billy suggested quickly. Pa's got an empty stall in the back, nice and cool. And there's a well right there. Medicine, Doc Morrison added thoughtfully. I've got some salves that might help with the mange, and there's herbs that can strengthen a weakened animal. Food, Martha chimed in. What does a baby horse eat? Milk? We've got cows. Sheriff Bradley watched this unexpected transformation with amazement. Just minutes ago, these same people had been ready to shoot the foal to end its suffering. Now they were organizing a rescue mission. He looked down at Aiyana, still kneeling in the dust beside the dying creature, and felt something shift in his own chest. All right, he said finally, but I want to be clear about something. He addressed the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of his office. This Apache, Aiyana, he's taking responsibility for this horse. Whatever happens, good or bad, it's on him. We're just helping out a neighbor. It was a careful distinction, one that allowed the townspeople to maintain their dignity while still participating in an act of mercy. Aiyana understood the politics of it and nodded his acceptance. I will take full responsibility, he agreed, but I will need help to move her. She is too weak to walk. Within minutes, the scene in Copper Ridge's main street had transformed completely. Billy Carver had run to fetch his father's horse cart, while Doc Morrison hurried back to his office for medical supplies. Miss Henderson bustled about organizing clean rags and fresh water, and even Jake Morrison, despite his earlier grumbling, helped clear a path to the livery stable. As they gently lifted the foal onto the cart, she opened her one good eye and looked directly at Aiyana. For a moment something passed between them again, a recognition, a trust, a shared understanding of what it meant to be lost and far from home. What will you call her? Martha asked, as they began the slow journey to the stable. Aiyana walked beside the cart, one hand resting protectively on the foal's neck. He considered the question seriously before answering. Itzel, he said finally. It means rainbow in my language, because she has traveled through the storm, and perhaps now she will find the sun again. As the small procession moved down the dusty street, none of them could have imagined that this moment, this simple act of compassion for a dying horse, would set in motion events that would forever change not just their own lives, but the relationship between two peoples who had known too much pain and too little understanding. The real story was just beginning. The livery stable was a sanctuary of cool shadows and sweet hay smells, a welcome refuge from the brutal afternoon sun. Sam Carver, Billy's father and the town's blacksmith, had cleared out the back stall and spread fresh straw on the floor. The big man stood back, his massive arms crossed over his leather apron, watching as they carefully transferred the foal from the cart to the makeshift sickbed. "Gentle now," Aiyana murmured, his hands supporting the little horse's head as Doc Morrison and Sheriff Bradley handled her hindquarters. "Easy at Searle, you are safe now." The foal's breathing was so shallow, it barely stirred the straw beneath her, and her skin felt hot to the touch, despite her obvious chill. Aiyana knelt beside her, his weathered hands moving with surprising tenderness as he examined her more thoroughly than he'd been able to in the street. "The infection in her eye is bad," he said quietly to Doc Morrison, who was unpacking his supplies. "And she has wounds on her legs, old ones, but they have not healed properly." Doc Morrison nodded grimly, setting out bottles of antiseptic and rolls of clean bandages. "I can see that, and look here." He pointed to several patches on the foal's coat where the hair had fallen out completely, leaving raw, inflamed skin. "This Mangy has been working on her for months. Probably started when she got too weak to groom herself properly." Miss Henderson appeared at the stall door, carrying a bucket of clean well water and an armload of soft rags. Behind her came Martha Wilkins, with a basin and what looked like her own good towels. "I brought these from the schoolhouse," Martha explained, a bit embarrassed. "They're the softest I could find. I thought, well, if we're going to clean her up." Aiyana looked up at the gathering group with something approaching wonder. In all his years of dealing with the people of Copper Ridge, he had never seen them band together like this. Usually their interactions with him were brief, businesslike, and formal. This outpouring of spontaneous compassion was something entirely new. "Thank you," he said simply, but the words carried deep meaning. "All of you. Itzel, she feels the kindness. Animals know when hearts are open to them." Sam Carver shifted uncomfortably at this slightly mystical observation, but nodded toward the water trough in the corner of the stable. "There's fresh water whenever you need it, and I've got some old blankets that might help keep her warm once the sun goes down." "She needs liquid first," Aiyana said, accepting a cup of water from Mrs. Henderson. "But not too much, or her stomach will rebel." He dipped his fingers in the cool water and gently moistened the foal's lips, just a little at a time. Itzel's tongue moved weakly, trying to capture the precious moisture. After a few moments, Aiyana carefully tilted a small amount of water into her mouth, watching to make sure she could swallow without distress. "That's a good sign," Doc Morrison observed. "She's still got the reflex. Now let me take a look at that eye." What followed was a delicate operation that required all of their combined patience. Doc Morrison carefully cleaned the infected eye while Aiyana held the foal's head steady, speaking to her in a mixture of English and Apache. The little horse whimpered but didn't struggle. She seemed to understand that these strange creatures were trying to help her. "The eye itself doesn't look damaged," Doc reported after a thorough examination. "The infection is bad, but if we can keep it clean and get some medicine into her, she might not lose her sight." As they worked, more townspeople began to drift into the stable. Word had spread quickly through Copper Ridge. It was a small town, and news traveled fast, and curiosity had overcome the usual afternoon lethargy. Old Pete shuffled in, his ancient mule tied outside, and stood quietly in the shadows, watching the proceedings. Several of the ranch hands from the surrounding spreads found excuses to stop by, ostensibly to check on their own horses, but really to see how the rescue was progressing. Most surprising of all was the arrival of Reverend Samuel Hayes, the town's Methodist minister, who appeared with a small jar of what he claimed was healing salve, made by his wife from herbs in her garden. "Margaret has a way with injured creatures," he explained to Aiyana, offering the jar with a slight awkwardness that spoke to the unusual nature of their interaction. "She's doctored everything from barn cats to injured sparrows. Said to tell you this works particularly well on skin ailments." Aiyana accepted the offering with grave courtesy. "Please thank your wife for her generosity. In my tradition, we believe that healing comes not just from medicine, but from the goodwill of the community. This little one is receiving much goodwill today." As the afternoon wore on, the stable began to take on the atmosphere of a community gathering. People came and went, some bringing supplies, others simply checking on the patient's progress. Billy Carver appointed himself as official water carrier, making sure there was always fresh water available. Martha Wilkins organized the medical supplies with the efficiency of someone used to managing classroom chaos. Even Jake Morrison, despite his earlier objections, contributed a bag of oats from his own horse's feed, claiming gruffly that they're just going to waste anyway. But it was Aiyana who remained the constant presence beside Itzel, rarely moving from his position by her head, speaking to her in low, soothing tones and monitoring every shallow breath. His dedication didn't go unnoticed. "You really think she's going to make it?" Sheriff Bradley asked during one of his check-ins, settling down on an upturned bucket beside the Apache. The two men had developed a grudging respect over the past couple of years, but this was perhaps the longest conversation they'd ever had. Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting gently on Itzel's neck. "She has survived 3 years alone," he said finally. 3 winters in the mountains, 3 summers with little water, 3 seasons of searching for something she has never found. That takes a spirit stronger than most people understand. "But is spirit enough?" Bradley pressed. "Doc Morrison says she's in pretty bad shape. And even if she lives through the night, what then? A sick horse is expensive to feed, and there's no guarantee she'll ever be healthy enough to work or ride." It was a practical question, the kind that frontier people had to ask. Resources were limited, and sentiment was a luxury that could be afforded only after survival was assured. Aiyana looked down at the foal, whose breathing had become slightly less labored over the past few hours. The water and rest were already beginning to show small effects. "In my father's time," he said slowly, "before the troubles between our peoples, there was a story told around winter fires, about a warrior who found an injured eagle in the desert, far from the mountains where eagles belong. The warrior's friend said, 'Why waste water and food on a bird that will never fly again? It would be kinder to end its suffering.'" Sheriff Bradley leaned forward, genuinely interested despite himself. "And what did the warrior do?" "He carried the eagle back to his village and cared for it through the winter, fed it, cleaned its wounds, spoke to it every day." The other warriors laughed at him, said he was foolish to spend so much effort on something that might never recover. Aiyana's voice grew softer, but when spring came, the eagle's wing had healed, and it flew away strong and free. And because the warrior had shown such kindness to one of the sky spirits, the eagles led him to a hidden valley where his people could live safely through the drought years that followed. Bradley nodded slowly. "So you're saying kindness comes back to those who give it?" "I am saying," Aiyana replied, "that sometimes we are asked to have faith in things we cannot see. This little horse, perhaps she will recover and become strong. Or perhaps she will teach us something more important than strength." As if responding to her name, Etzel stirred slightly and opened her good eye. For the first time since her collapse, she lifted her head just a few inches off the straw and looked directly at Aiyana. Her gaze was still clouded with illness, but there was something in it now that hadn't been there before, a spark of awareness of hope. "Well, I'd be damned," Sheriff Bradley whispered. "She's fighting." The moment seemed to energize the entire stable. Miss Henderson, who had been dozing in a chair by the door, sat up straighter. Doc Morrison hurried over to check the foal's pulse and breathing. Even Sam Carver, busy at his anvil in the front of the stable, paused in his work to listen. Her breathing is definitely stronger, Doc reported after his examination. And look, she's trying to focus her eyes. That's a very good sign. Encouraged by this small improvement, Aiyana offered Itzal another few drops of water, which she accepted more eagerly than before. Then, with infinite patience, he began to clean some of the dirt and matted hair from her coat with one of Martha's soft towels. As he worked, he found himself talking to the foal in a mixture of languages, telling her stories of the high country where she had been born, of the green meadows and clear streams that existed in the mountains beyond the desert. Some of the townspeople gathered around to listen, drawn by the musical quality of the Apache language and the gentle way he spoke to the injured animal. "What are you telling her?" Martha asked curiously. Aiyana paused in his grooming. "I am telling her about her home," he said, "the place where she was born, where her mother taught her to run and play. I think she remembers, and it gives her strength to remember good times." "You've been to that country?" Billy asked, fascinated. "The high meadows up north?" A shadow crossed Aiyana's face. "I was born there," he said quietly. "My people lived in those mountains for many generations. The grass grew thick, the streams ran clear and cold, and there was game enough for everyone." His voice grew distant. "It was a good place to raise children, to grow old watching the sunrise paint the peaks gold every morning." The stable fell quiet, everyone suddenly aware of the pain underlying his simple words. The troubles that had scattered both Apache and white settlers from the northern mountains were still fresh wounds for all of them. Mrs. Henderson was the first to break the silence. Is that where you lost your daughter?" she asked gently. Aiyana's hand stilled on Itzal's coat. For a moment it seemed he might not answer. Then, so quietly they had to strain to hear him, he said, "She was 7 years old. Her name was Aiyana Chelina, eternal blossom. She had her mother's laugh and her grandmother's way with animals." He looked down at the foal. "She would have loved this little horse." "What happened to her?" Martha whispered, though she was afraid to hear the answer. "The soldiers came in early spring," Aiyana said, his voice carefully controlled. "They said all Apache had to move to the reservation, that the mountains were needed for white settlement. But some of our people had lived there for so many generations, they did not know how to be anywhere else. There was resistance, fighting." He was quiet for a long moment, and when he continued, his words came slowly as if each one cost him something. "I was away trading with a settlement 2 days' ride south. When I returned," he stopped, unable to finish. "I'm sorry," Sheriff Bradley said quietly, and he meant it. "I'm truly sorry for your loss." Aiyana nodded, accepting the sympathy. "My wife, Aiyana Chelina, many others. They were gone. Some fled deeper into the mountains. Some were taken to the reservation. Some—" he shrugged helplessly. "I searched for 2 years, but I never found what happened to my daughter. If she lives, she would be 10 years old now. If she lives." The weight of his words settled over the group, like a heavy blanket. Here was a man who had lost everything: home, family, people, way of life, and yet he knelt in their stable, patiently nursing a dying horse back to health. "Is that why you care so much about the foal?" Doc Morrison asked gently. "Because she reminds you of your daughter?" Aiyana considered the question seriously. "Partly," he admitted, "but also because she is like all of us who have been lost, who have wandered far from home, looking for something we cannot name. She has kept hope alive when hope seemed foolish. She deserves to have someone believe in her." As if understanding his words, Itzal attempted to raise her head again, this time managing to lift it several inches higher than before. Her good eye tracked to each face around her, as if taking inventory of her new family. "She's definitely getting stronger," Doc Morrison observed with professional satisfaction. "I think she might actually make it through the night." "And if she does?" Jake Morrison asked, having joined the group despite his earlier skepticism. "What then?" "You can't live in our stable forever, Aiyana," and a horse needs proper care. It was a fair question, and one that had been lurking in everyone's mind. Aiyana had no permanent home in Copper Ridge. He lived somewhere in the desert, appearing periodically to trade and then disappearing again. A recovering horse would need consistent care and feeding. I have been thinking about that, Aiyana admitted. There is a place half a day's ride from here where I make my camp in winter. There is grass and a spring, and it is sheltered from the wind. If she grows strong enough to travel. That's a big if, Sheriff Bradley pointed out. And what about feed? Medicine? She's going to need more care than just grass and water. Before Aiyana could respond, Mrs. Henderson spoke up unexpectedly. I could help with supplies, she said. Feed, medicine, whatever she needs. Call it an investment in the community. And I could check on her regular like, Doc Morrison added. Make sure the infection doesn't come back and that she's healing properly. I could help too, Billy volunteered eagerly. I know horses, and I could ride out with feed and supplies whenever needed. One by one, the townspeople began volunteering assistance. Sam Carver offered to make any ironwork needed. Shoes, hardware, whatever might help. Martha Wilkins promised to organize a collection of blankets and warm clothing for Aiyana's desert camp. Even Reverend Hayes mentioned that his wife had expressed interest in learning more about herbal animal medicine. Aiyana listened to these offers with growing amazement. Why? He asked, finally. Why would you do this for me? For her, we are not your people. Sheriff Raddle scratched his graying beard, thoughtfully. You know, Aiyana, I've been thinking about that. Maybe the problem all these years hasn't been that we're different peoples. Maybe the problem has been that we forgot we're all just. As the evening light began to slant through the stable windows, casting long golden bars across the straw, Itzel made her most significant improvement yet. With tremendous effort, she managed to shift her position slightly, tucking her legs more comfortably beneath her. It was a small movement, but it represented a huge step forward. The first time she had shown any interest in making herself comfortable, rather than simply enduring. Look at that, Martha breathed. She's settling in. She's decided to stay.
Aiyana smiled for the first time since arriving in town that morning.
Yes, he said softly, gently stroking the foal's neck. I think she has decided to trust us. Now we must prove ourselves worthy of that trust. As the sun set behind the western mountains, casting Copper Ridge into cool purple shadows, the little community that had formed around one dying horse began to disperse. But they all understood that something had changed in their town that day. A bridge had been built across a gap that many had thought unbridgeable, and it had been constructed not with grand gestures or formal treaties, but with simple acts of kindness toward a creature too weak to survive on her own. The healing had begun, not just for Itzel, but for all of them. 3 days had passed since Itzel's collapse, and the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The little Mustang Foal had progressed from near death to sitting upright, her infected eye now clear and bright, tracking movement with alert curiosity. Her coat, while still patchy from the mange, had begun to show signs of healthy regrowth where Aiyana's patient care and Doc Morrison's medicines had taken effect. The Apache had barely left her side, sleeping on a bedroll in the adjacent stall and taking his meals from a steady stream of offerings brought by the townspeople. What had started as a simple act of mercy had evolved into something unprecedented in Copper Ridge's history, a full community adoption, both horse and horseman. On this particular morning, Aiyana sat cross-legged beside Itzel, carefully brushing the tangles from her mane with a comb. Martha Wilkins had donated from her own dressing table. The foal leaned into his touch, clearly enjoying the attention, and occasionally nuzzled his shoulder with growing affection. She's looking almost like a real horse again, Billy Carver observed, leaning against the stall door with a bucket of fresh oats. At 15, he had appointed himself Aiyana's chief assistant, arriving each morning before school and returning immediately afterward to help with Itzel's care. She was always a real horse, Aiyana replied gently, accepting the feed bucket with a nod of thanks. She just needed to remember how to be one. Itzil's ears pricked forward at the sight of the oats, and she stretched her neck toward the bucket with considerably more energy than she had shown 3 days earlier. Her appetite had returned with a vengeance, much to everyone's relief. "Little one," Aiyana murmured, offering her small handfuls of grain. "Too much, too fast will make your stomach rebel against us." As the foal ate, Sam Carver appeared in the stable doorway, but his usual cheerful demeanor was notably absent. The big blacksmith looked troubled, glancing nervously over his shoulder before approaching the stall. "Aiyana," he said quietly, "we might have a problem." The Apache looked up from his patient, immediately alert to the tension in Sam's voice. "What kind of problem?" "Riders coming in from the east," Sam explained, keeping his voice low. "3 of them, riding hard. Billy spotted them from the smithy. They'll be here within the hour." Billy straightened, suddenly serious. "I couldn't make out much from the distance, but one of them looked like he might be wearing a cavalry uniform." A chill settled over the stable despite the warm morning air. Aiyana's hand stilled on Itzil's neck, and his face became carefully neutral, an expression the townspeople had learned to recognize as his way of preparing for trouble. "Did they see me enter town?" he asked. "Don't know," Sam admitted, "but if they're looking for you specifically, the implications hung unspoken in the air." While Aiyana had been trading peacefully with Copper Ridge for over 2 years, his legal status was ambiguous at best. Most Apache were supposed to be on reservations, and a rogue native found off reservation land could face arrest, imprisonment, or worse. "You could leave," Billy suggested urgently. "Right now, before they get here, take the back trail out of town." Aiyana looked down at Itzil, who had paused in her eating to gaze up at him with trusting eyes. The foal had made remarkable progress, but she was still far too weak to travel. Moving her now could undo all the healing of the past 3 days. "I will not abandon her," he said quietly but firmly, "not when she needs care the most." "Then we'll hide you," Sam declared. "There's space in the root cellar behind the store or the old mine shaft up the hill. They can't arrest what they can't find." Before Aiyana could respond, Sheriff Bradley appeared in the doorway, his face grim and his hand resting unconsciously on his gun belt. "Sam's told you about the riders?" he asked without preamble. Aiyana nodded. "Billy says one might be cavalry." "More than might be," Bradley confirmed. "I got a good look at them through my spyglass. Lieutenant Collins from Fort Apache, plus 2 enlisted men. They're riding like they've got specific business in mind." The name hit Aiyana like a physical blow. Lieutenant James Collins was well known among the Apache as a man who believed that the only good Indian was one firmly under military control. He had been involved in several of the most brutal pacification campaigns and had a particular hatred for Apache who refused to stay on the reservation. "Collins," Aiyana repeated, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes, I know of him, and he knows of you," Sheriff Bradley said grimly. "Question is, what does he want?" As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the morning air. The steady drum of hoofbeats grew louder until it stopped directly outside the stable. "Henderson," a harsh voice called out. "Where's your sheriff? I need to speak with him, immediately." Sheriff Bradley straightened, his jaw setting with determination. "That's my cue," he muttered. Then, looking directly at Aiyana, he said, "You stay put. Let me handle this." "Tom," Aiyana began, but the sheriff held up a hand. "You're under my protection while you're in this town," Bradley said firmly. "That means something, and Collins knows it." As the sheriff strode out to meet the cavalry officers, Sam and Billy moved closer to Aiyana, forming an unconscious protective circle around the stall. Other townspeople began to appear as well. Miss Henderson emerged from her store. Doc Morrison stepped out of his office, and Martha Wilkins hurried down from the schoolhouse, her face tight with concern. Through the stable's open doors they could hear the conversation outside. "Sheriff Bradley," Lieutenant Collins' voice carried clearly in the morning air. "I'm looking for a rogue Apache who's been reported in this area. Goes by the name Aiyana. You seen anyone matching that description?" "Depends," Sheriff Bradley replied evenly. What's he supposed to have done? He's off reservation land without proper authorization, Collins snapped. That's enough. Plus there's been reports of stolen livestock in the area and missing supplies from homesteads. Whenever there's an Apache unaccounted for, there's usually theft involved. That's a pretty broad accusation, Lieutenant. Bradley's voice remained calm but carried an edge of warning. You got any specific evidence linking this particular Apache to any particular crime? I don't need specific evidence, Collins shot back. Standing orders are to return all Apache to reservation land, by force if necessary. Now I'm asking you again, have you seen him? There was a pause, and everyone in the stable held their breath. Then Sheriff Bradley's voice came again, measured and deliberate. I've seen an Apache trader named Aiyana. Been coming through town regularly for over 2 years. Buys supplies, sells crafts, pays his bills and causes no trouble. Far as I'm concerned, he's a legitimate businessman. Businessman? Collins laughed harshly. These people don't understand business, Sheriff. They understand theft and violence and not much else. Where is he? Inside the stable, Aiyana's face had gone stone still. Billy noticed his hands clenching and unclenching, the only sign of the anger building within him. Even if I knew, Sheriff Bradley replied, I'd need to see proper authorization before turning over anyone in my jurisdiction to military custody. You got papers? I don't need papers for a rogue Apache. In my town, you need papers for anybody. Bradley's voice hardened. This is civilian territory, Lieutenant, not your reservation. You want to arrest someone, you follow civilian law. The tension outside was palpable, and inside the stable the townspeople exchanged worried glances. Everyone knew that military authority often trumped civilian law when it came to Indian matters, and Collins didn't sound like a man who respected legal niceties. Sheriff, came a new voice, Mrs. Henderson, speaking from her store porch. Is there some problem here? No problem, ma'am, Sheriff Bradley replied. Just some confusion about jurisdiction. Well, I hope it gets cleared up soon, Mrs. Henderson said loudly enough for everyone to hear. We've got important business to attend to today. The whole town's been helping nurse a sick horse back to health, and we can't have folks getting distracted from that. It was a signal, and the townspeople understood it immediately. Within moments, what seemed like half of Copper Ridge began emerging from buildings and gathering in the street. Doc Morrison approached with his medical bag. Martha Wilkins arrived with fresh bandages. Sam Carver appeared with his tools, and even Reverend Hayes materialized with his wife's healing salves. Quite a crowd for a sick horse, Lieutenant Collins observed suspiciously. She's not just any horse, Billy said boldly, stepping forward despite his father's cautioning hand on his shoulder. She's special, been lost for years, and now she's finally found her way home. Found her way home? One of the enlisted men asked, genuinely curious despite the tension. 3 days ago, she collapsed right here in our main street, Martha explained, her teacher's instincts taking over. Barely alive, covered in mange, starving, most pitiful sight you ever saw. But then this Apache trader, Aiyana, he took one look at her and said she could be saved, Doc Morrison added. Been working day and night ever since, nursing her back to health. Apache trader, Collins' voice sharpened with interest. Oh yes, Mrs. Henderson said innocently. Wonderful man. Been trading with us for years. Honest as the day is long, and gentle as a lamb with injured creatures. You should see what he's done for this poor little horse. Where is this trader now? Collins asked, his tone deceptively casual. Right where he's been for 3 days, Sheriff Bradley replied, taking care of his patient. Before Collins could respond, an unexpected sound echoed from the stable, a soft whinny followed by what sounded unmistakably like hoofbeats on straw. Lord have mercy, Sam Carver exclaimed, genuine amazement in his voice. She's standing up. The crowd surged toward the stable, and even Lieutenant Collins found himself swept along by the general excitement. Inside the building they discovered Aiyana kneeling beside Itzel, who had indeed managed to rise to her feet for the first time since her collapse. The little foal stood on shaking legs, leaning heavily against Aiyana for support, but she was upright and alert. "Well, I'll be damned," Doc Morrison breathed. 3 days ago, I wouldn't have given her one chance in 100. "It's a miracle," Martha whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. Lieutenant Collins found himself staring at the scene before him. The Apache he'd come to arrest was gently supporting a obviously sick but recovering horse, surrounded by a crowd of white townspeople who were looking at both man and animal with expressions of genuine affection and respect. "This is the rogue Apache you're looking for," Sheriff Bradley said quietly, appearing at Collins' shoulder. "Spent the last 3 days saving a dying horse's life with the help of our entire community. Still think he's a dangerous criminal." Collins' jaw worked silently as he struggled with this unexpected situation. His orders were clear: return all off-reservation Apache to military custody. But his audience was equally clear: an entire town of white civilians who were obviously invested in this particular Apache's welfare. "He's still off-reservation land without authorization," Collins said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "And he's also the reason this town has come together like never before." Reverend Hayes spoke up unexpectedly. "Sometimes God works through the most unlikely instruments. Lieutenant, perhaps you should ask yourself whether your mission here serves a higher purpose than simple adherence to regulation." Itzel chose that moment to take her first tentative step, still leaning on Aiyana, but moving under her own power. The crowd held its collective breath as she managed 2, then 3 steps before settling back down onto the straw with a soft sigh of exhaustion. "She walked," Billy whispered in wonder. "She actually walked." Aiyana looked up from his patient and met Lieutenant Collins' eyes directly for the first time. When he spoke, his voice was calm and dignified. "I am Aiyana of the Chiricahua Apache," he said formally. "I have been living peacefully in this territory for 3 years, harming no one, taking only what I need, giving back what I can. If you believe I have broken your laws, then I will come with you. But I ask that you allow me to finish what I have started here. This little horse depends on me." Collins stared at him for a long moment, clearly struggling with conflicting impulses. Finally he turned to Sheriff Bradley. "I'll need to send a report to my commanding officer," he said stiffly. "He'll want to know about this situation." "You do that," Sheriff Bradley replied. "And while you're at it, you might mention that this Apache has the full support of this community. Any action taken against him would be noticed." It was a polite way of saying that arresting Aiyana would cause significant political complications. Collins was experienced enough to recognize the warning. "I'll be back," he said finally, with proper authorization and clear orders. As the cavalry officers prepared to leave, Lieutenant Collins paused at the stable door and looked back at the scene inside. The Apache tenderly caring for the recovering foal, surrounded by supportive townspeople. "Why?" he asked suddenly. "Why risk everything for one sick horse?" Aiyana considered the question seriously before answering. "Because sometimes," he said quietly, "the most important battles are fought not for territory or revenge, but simply to prove that kindness still exists in the world." Collins stared at him for another moment, then turned and walked away without another word. As the sound of departing horses faded into the distance, the tension in the stable slowly began to ease. But everyone understood that this was only a temporary reprieve. Collins would be back, and next time he would come with orders that couldn't be ignored or deflected. "What will you do?" Martha asked Aiyana quietly. Aiyana looked down at Itzel, who had settled comfortably in her straw bed and was watching the proceedings with bright, intelligent eyes. "I will do what I have always done," he said simply. "I will take care of those who depend on me and trust that the path will reveal itself when it is time." But privately he began to make plans, because he had learned long ago that survival often depended not just on hope and kindness, but on being prepared for the moment when both ran out. A week had passed since Lieutenant Collins' visit, and Itzel's recovery had continued at a pace that amazed even Doc Morris. The foal was now walking steadily around the stable, her coat growing in thick and glossy where the mange had been defeated, and her eyes bright with curiosity and growing trust. But more than her physical healing, it was the bond between horse and man that had become the talk of Copper Ridge. Aiyana had established a routine that the townspeople had come to recognize and respect. Each morning before dawn, he would lead Itzel out to the small paddock behind the stable for gentle exercise. The foal followed him like a devoted dog, never needing a rope or halter, responding to his voice and gestures with an almost supernatural understanding. On this particular morning, Martha Wilkins arrived early to find Aiyana sitting in the paddock, his back against the fence post, while Itzel grazed peacefully nearby. The scene was so tranquil, it looked like something from a painting, but Martha noticed that the Apache's usual calm seemed strained. "You're troubled," she observed, settling down on the fence rail, with the directness of a woman who had spent years reading the moods of children and adults alike. Aiyana looked up at her with a slight smile. "You are very observant, Martha Wilkins." "Yes, I am troubled." "Collins?" "Partly." Aiyana's hand absently reached out to stroke Itzel's neck as she wandered close to him. "But also something else, something I have been trying to understand since the day I first saw this little one." Martha waited patiently. Over the past week, she had learned that Aiyana often worked through complex thoughts by speaking them aloud, but he needed time and space to find the right words. "She knows me," he said finally. "Not just as the man who feeds her and cares for her wounds, but she knows me." There is a recognition in her eyes that goes beyond gratitude or affection. "What do you mean?" Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, watching as Itzel explored the far corner of the paddock, with the cautious curiosity of a creature still learning to trust her environment. "My daughter," he said slowly. "She had a special gift with animals. Horses especially. From the time she could walk, she could speak to them in ways that seemed almost magical. My wife used to say that Aiyana Chalana had been touched by the horse spirits in her mother's womb." Martha felt her heart constrict at the pain in his voice. "Tell me about her." "She was luminous," Aiyana said, the English word seeming inadequate for what he wanted to express. "Like sunlight on water, always moving, always changing, but always beautiful, and brave, perhaps too brave for such a small person." He smiled at some memory. "When she was 6, she found an injured hawk with a broken wing. She carried it home in her shirt, bleeding from its talons, but she would not let it go because she said it was too frightened to be alone." "She sounds like her father," Martha observed gently. "She was better than her father," Aiyana replied. "Kinder, wiser, more trusting. She believed that every creature deserved love, even the ones that seemed lost or broken." He paused, then added quietly, "Especially the ones that seemed lost or broken." As if summoned by his words, Itzel left her grazing and wandered over to where Aiyana sat, lowering her head to nuzzle his shoulder with gentle affection. The gesture was so tender, so clearly meant to comfort, that Martha felt tears prick her eye. "She's trying to take care of you," Martha whispered. "Yes," Aiyana agreed. "Just as my daughter would have done." He stood slowly, his hand trailing along Itzel's neck. "Martha, I must tell you something that I have told no one else. Something that frightens me." "What is it?" Aiyana took a deep breath, as if preparing to voice something that had been weighing on him for days. 3 nights ago, I had a dream. In this dream I was back in the high country, in the meadow where my daughter used to play. She was there, but not as I last saw her. She was older, perhaps 10 years old as she would be now if she still lives. And she was not alone." Martha leaned forward, sensing the importance of what he was about to say. "She was with a small Mustang Foal, and they were playing together as she used to play with the horses in our village. In the dream, my daughter looked at me and said, 'Father, I have sent you a gift. She will lead you to what you seek. But first you must heal her heart as she heals yours.'" The words hung in the morning air like a prayer. Martha found herself looking at Itzel with new eyes, seeing not just a rescued horse, but a creature whose very presence seemed to radiate purpose. "Do you think," she began hesitantly, "do you think it's possible that your daughter is somehow—" "I don't know," Aiyana said honestly. "In my people's tradition, we believe that the spirits of those we love can sometimes reach across the distance between worlds to touch our lives. Whether this little horse is guided by my daughter's spirit, or whether she simply carries some echo of that love, I cannot say. But I know that caring for her has awakened something in my heart that I thought was dead forever." Before Martha could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. Both of them tensed, immediately thinking of Lieutenant Collins, but the riders who appeared around the corner of the stable were unexpected. A middle-aged white woman, riding side-saddle on a well-groomed mare, accompanied by a younger man who had the look of a ranch foreman. The woman dismounted with practiced ease and approached the paddock fence with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being in charge of her own affairs. She was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair pinned back in a practical style, and clothes that spoke of comfortable prosperity rather than ostentation. "Excuse me," she called out. "I'm looking for the Apache who's been caring for the injured Mustang. Would that be you?" Aiyana straightened, immediately alert. Unexpected visitors often meant trouble, and this woman's direct manner suggested she had specific business in mind. "I am Aiyana," he replied carefully. "This is Itzel, the horse you speak of. How may I help you?" The woman studied him for a moment, then looked past him to where Itzel stood, watching the newcomers with alert but unafraid eyes. Something in the woman's expression shifted, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a note of wonder. "My God," she whispered. "It really is her." Martha asked, confused by the woman's reaction. The woman seemed to shake herself back to the present. "Forgive me, I'm Helen McKinley. My husband and I own the Double M Ranch, about 60 miles north of here, up in the high country." Aiyana's entire body went still. The high country, the place where both he and Itzel had lost their families. 3 years ago, Helen continued, her voice growing thick with emotion, "we were forced to abandon our ranch when the troubles started. The army said it wasn't safe for civilians in that area anymore, that we had to evacuate until the Apache situation was resolved." She paused, looking directly at Aiyana with an expression that was part apology, part understanding. "We had livestock that we couldn't move in time, cattle, horses, chickens. We had to leave most of them behind, hoping we could come back for them later. But we never could. By the time it was safe to return, everything was gone, scattered to the wind, or," she swallowed hard, "we assumed everything had died." "You said you recognized the horse," Martha prompted gently. Helen nodded, wiping at her eyes. "We had a breeding mare named Star, a beautiful Mustang we'd captured and gentled years before. She was pregnant when we left, due to foal any day. We had to leave her behind. It broke my heart, but there was no choice. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity." Aiyana looked at Itzel with new understanding, seeing in her markings and conformation the echoes of bloodlines he should have recognized sooner. "Star had a distinctive white marking," Helen continued, pointing to a small star-shaped patch on Itzel's forehead that had become visible as her coat grew back. "And the way she carries her head, that proud arch of her neck. This is Star's foal. I'm certain of it." "But how did you know to come here?" Aiyana asked, his voice tight with emotion. Helen's companion spoke for the first time. "Word travels fast in ranch country," he said. "Story of an Apache saving a dying Mustang Foal has reached every settlement from here to the territorial capital." McKinley heard the description and knew right away it had to be Star's baby. "I had to come," Helen said simply. "I had to see for myself and to thank you for saving her. We thought we'd lost everything from our old life, but here she is, alive and healthy because of your kindness." Aiyana felt the world shifting around him as connections formed that he hadn't dared to imagine. "Mrs. McKinley," he said slowly, "when you lived in the high country, Did you know of Apache families who lived in that area? Oh yes, Helen replied immediately. There were several families who had camps in the mountains. Peaceful people mostly. We traded with them sometimes. They were skilled with horses and leather work, and we needed all the neighbors we could get in that isolated country. Do you remember? Aiyana asked, his voice barely above a whisper. A family with a little girl, perhaps 7 years old, who had a special way with horses. Helen's face went very still. Aiyana Chelina, she breathed. The little blossom. Oh dear God, you're her father. The confirmation hit Aiyana like a physical blow. Helen McKinley had known his daughter, had traded with his people, had been part of the same small community that had been scattered by the Troubles 3 years ago. She used to come to our ranch sometimes with her parents. Helen continued, tears streaming down her face now. Such a beautiful, bright child. She could gentle the wildest horse just by talking to it. Star adored her, would follow her around like a pet dog. What happened? Aiyana asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. When the Troubles started, what happened to my people? Helen looked stricken. I don't know, she admitted. The evacuation happened so fast, and there was so much chaos. The army said all the Apache had been relocated to safer areas, but we never knew if that was true or if... She couldn't finish the sentence. Some fled deeper into the mountains, her foreman added quietly. Some were taken to the reservation, and some, he shrugged helplessly. The 3 adults stood in heavy silence, each lost in their own thoughts about loss and survival and the cruel randomness of fate. But it was Itzel who broke the spell, walking over to Helen with the same gentle confidence she showed with everyone who approached her with kindness. The older woman reached out tentatively to stroke the foal's neck, and Itzel leaned into the touch with obvious pleasure. She remembers you, Martha said wonderingly. Look at how she's responding to you. Horses never forget, Helen said through her tears, especially when they're loved. She looked up at Aiyana with profound gratitude. You've given me back a piece of my old life that I thought was lost forever. How can I ever repay such a gift? Aiyana was quiet for a long moment, watching as Itzel enjoyed the attention from this woman who represented a connection to her earliest days. When he finally spoke, his words surprised everyone. Perhaps, he said slowly, the question is not how you can repay me, but how we can help each other find what we have both lost. What do you mean? You lost your ranch, your livestock, your way of life in the high country. I lost my family, my people, my daughter. But we have both found something here. This little horse has brought us together, shown us that survival sometimes requires building new families from the pieces of broken ones. Helen studied his face intently. What are you suggesting? I am suggesting, Aiyana said, that perhaps Itzel has done what my dream said she would. She has led me to what I seek. Not my daughter, at least not yet, but someone who knew her, who cared for her, who can help me continue the search. The possibility hung between them like a bridge, waiting to be crossed. Helen looked at her foreman, then back at Aiyana, clearly wrestling with emotions and possibilities she hadn't anticipated. The ranch, she said finally, it's still there, still legally ours. We've been trying to decide to sell it or try to rebuild. If we were to go back, try to start over, you would need help, Aiyana finished. Someone who knows the country, knows the dangers, knows how to survive in that harsh land. And you would need a base of operations for your search, Helen added, understanding dawning in her eyes. Somewhere safe, with resources, with people who support your cause. Martha watched this exchange with growing excitement. You're talking about partnership, she said. Going back to the high country together, rebuilding what was lost. More than rebuilding, Aiyana said quietly, creating something new. A place where Apache and white settlers can live as neighbors again, as we did before the trouble. A place where lost children and lost horses can find their way home. Before Helen could respond, the sound of multiple horses approaching at high speed shattered the morning peace. This time there was no mistaking the military bearing of the riders. Lieutenant Collins had returned, and he had brought reinforcements. But as the soldiers rounded the corner and saw the gathering at the paddock, they found something unexpected. Not just the Apache they'd come to arrest, but a prominent white rancher, the town's school teacher, and a horse that was clearly the center of everyone's attention. "Mrs. McKinley," Collins said, clearly surprised to recognize the woman. "What are you doing here?" Helen McKinley straightened to her full height and fixed the lieutenant with a look that could have frozen fire. "I am reclaiming my property, Lieutenant," she said with icy dignity. "This horse belonged to my ranch, and this man has spent the past week nursing her back to health. I am here to thank him and to discuss business arrangements." It was a masterful deflection, turning what had been a military arrest into a civilian property matter. Collins found himself momentarily wrong-footed by the unexpected complexity of the situation. "Ma'am, this Apache is off reservation land without proper authorization. I have orders." "You have orders concerning criminals, Lieutenant," Helen interrupted smoothly. "This man is my business partner. He has been caring for my livestock and will be accompanying me back to my ranch to help with reconstruction efforts. Unless you have some specific charge against him, I fail to see how military jurisdiction applies." The word partner hung in the air like a challenge. Collins looked from Helen to Aiyana to the horse, clearly struggling to process this development. "Business partner," he repeated skeptically. "That's right," Helen said firmly. "Mr. Aiyana has agreed to serve as ranch foreman for the Double M operation. His knowledge of the high country and his skills with livestock make him invaluable for our return to that territory." It was a lie, but it was a lie told with such conviction and authority that it sounded like established fact. Aiyana looked at Helen with newfound respect, understanding that she was offering him not just partnership but protection under the cover of legitimate employment. "Is this true?" Collins demanded, turning to Aiyana. Aiyana looked at Helen, then at Itzel, then at Martha, seeing in their faces the reflection of possibilities he had never dared to imagine. When he spoke, his voice was steady and sure. "It is true," he said. "McKinley has offered me employment and the chance to return to the land where my family once lived. I have accepted." Collins stared at him for a long moment, clearly frustrated by this unexpected turn of events. A rogue Apache could be arrested without much paperwork, but an Apache with legitimate employment by a respected white rancher was a different matter entirely, one that would require careful consideration and probably approval from higher authorities. "I'll need documentation," he said finally, "proper employment papers, territorial permits, the whole legal framework." "Of course," Helen replied smoothly. "I'll have my attorney in Tucson draw up all the necessary documents. In the meantime, I trust there's no objection to Mr. Aiyana completing his current responsibilities here." It was phrased as a question, but delivered with the tone of someone who expected immediate agreement. Collins found himself nodding before he quite realized he was doing it. "1 week," he said stiffly. "I'll give you 1 week to get the paperwork in order. After that, if everything isn't completely legal and proper, it will be," Helen assured him. "You have my word." As the soldiers departed, the small group stood in stunned silence, hardly believing what had just transpired. In the space of 1 morning, everything had changed. Old connections had been revealed, new partnerships had been forged, and a path forward had opened that none of them could have anticipated. "Did you mean it?" Martha asked Helen quietly. "About the partnership?" Helen looked at Aiyana, then at Itzel, who was peacefully grazing as if the drama of the past hour had been nothing more than mildly interesting entertainment. "I meant every word," she said firmly. "This little horse has given me back something I thought was lost forever. If she can do that, maybe she can help all of us find what we're looking for." Aiyana knelt beside Itzel and gently stroked her neck, marveling at the series of miraculous coincidences that had brought them all together. "My daughter's gift," he murmured, so quietly that only Martha heard him, "just as she promised in the dream." As the sun climbed higher over Copper Ridge, casting new light on old wounds and fresh possibilities, None of them could have guessed that their greatest challenges and their most profound discoveries still lay ahead. But for the first time in 3 years, Aiyana allowed himself to believe that the path home might truly be within reach. 2 months had passed since that pivotal morning when Helen McKinley had arrived in Copper Ridge, and the transformation in both Itzal and the community around her had been remarkable. The foal had grown strong and healthy, her coat now a lustrous chestnut, with distinctive white markings, her eyes bright with intelligence and trust. But more than her physical recovery, it was her role as a bridge between worlds that had made her truly special. The partnership between Aiyana and Helen had proven both practical and profound. Helen's resources and legal standing had provided the protection and legitimacy that Aiyana needed, while his knowledge of the high country and his skills as a horseman had given her the expertise required to rebuild her ranch. Together they had spent weeks planning their return to the northern mountains, gathering supplies, hiring workers, and preparing for the challenges of reclaiming land that had been abandoned for 3 years. But it was the search for Aiyana's daughter that had become the true heart of their mission. Helen had used her connections throughout the territory to gather information about Apache families who had been displaced during the Troubles. Slowly, painstakingly, they had pieced together fragments of stories, rumors, and possibilities. On this crisp autumn morning, their small caravan prepared to leave Copper Ridge for what might be the final time. 3 wagons loaded with supplies, 6 hired workers, Helen and her foreman, Aiyana, and most importantly, Itzal, now grown strong enough to make the journey north. The townspeople had gathered to see them off, and the scene was unlike anything Copper Ridge had ever witnessed. These were the same people who, just months earlier, had been ready to put a dying horse out of her misery. Now they stood with tears in their eyes, saying goodbye to the Apache who had become part of their community, and the horse who had taught them about the power of compassion. "You'll write to us?" Martha Wilkins asked, embracing Helen with the warmth of a true friend. "Let us know how the search goes." "Of course," Helen promised, "and you're all welcome to visit once we get the ranch operational again. The high country is beautiful. You should see it when the wildflowers bloom in spring." Sheriff Bradley approached Aiyana with the slightly awkward manner of a man unaccustomed to emotional farewells. "You take care of yourself up there," he said gruffly, "and if you need anything at all, you send word. Copper Ridge doesn't forget its friends." Aiyana clasped the sheriff's hand with genuine warmth. "Thank you, Tom Bradley, for everything. You showed me that enemies can become family when hearts are open to change." Doc Morrison had a special farewell for Itzal, offering her one final examination and pronouncing her fit for travel. "She's a miracle," he said, running his hands along her strong legs and clear eyes. 3 months ago, I wouldn't have given her 1 chance in 100. Now look at her." Indeed, Itzal was magnificent, no longer the skeletal dying creature who had collapsed in their street. She stood proud and alert, her coat gleaming in the morning sun, her eyes bright with anticipation. She wore a simple halter that Aiyana had made from soft leather, but she needed no rope or restraint. She stayed close to him with the devotion of a creature who had found her person. Billy Carver, now 16 and taller by several inches, had been given permission to accompany them for the first few days of their journey. The boy had become devoted to both Aiyana and Itzal, and his parents had agreed that the experience would be educational. Helen asked, climbing onto the seat of the lead wagon. Aiyana swung up beside her, while Itzal took her customary position, walking alongside the wagon, free but never straying far from her companions. The caravan began to move, rolling out of Copper Ridge toward the northern mountains and whatever awaited them there. The journey took 4 days through increasingly rugged terrain. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape changed from desert scrub to pine forests, from red rock to granite peaks, from harsh heat to crisp, thin air that tasted of snow and possibility. On the evening of the 4th day, they crested a ridge and saw it spread out before them, the high valley that had once been home to both Helen's ranch and Aiyana's people. The sight took their breath away. The meadows were gold with autumn grass. surrounded by dark forests that climbed the sides of mountains which seemed to touch the sky. A crystal stream wound through the valley floor, and in the distance they could see the ruins of buildings that had once been the Double M Ranch headquarters. But it was Itzel's reaction that surprised them all. The moment she saw the valley, she lifted her head and released a long, piercing whinny that echoed off the surrounding peaks. Then, without warning, she broke into a run, galloping down into the meadow with the joy of a creature returning to a place she had never forgotten. "She remembers," Helen whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She remembers being born here." They made camp that night beside the ruins of the old ranch house, and as the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Aiyana sat beside their campfire and felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Itzel grazed nearby, completely content in this place that represented her true home. She had led them here just as his dream had promised, but Aiyana sensed that their journey was not yet complete. The next morning brought the answer to that feeling. As Aiyana was preparing breakfast, Itzel suddenly lifted her head and stared intently toward the eastern rim of the valley. Her ears pricked forward, and she released another of her piercing calls. "What is it, girl?" Aiyana asked, following her gaze. What he saw made his heart stop. Silhouetted against the morning sky, a small figure stood on the ridge overlooking their camp. A child, watching them from a distance too great to make out details, but something about the posture, the way the figure held itself. "Helen," Aiyana called urgently. "Look." Helen grabbed her spyglass and focused it on the distant figure. After a moment, she lowered the instrument, her face pale with excitement. "It's a girl," she said breathlessly. "Maybe 10 or 11 years old. She's Apache, I think. And she's not alone, there are others with her. Adults staying back in the trees." Aiyana's hands were shaking as he took the spyglass and looked for himself. The distance was too great to see facial features clearly, but something deep in his father's heart recognized the way the child moved, the proud set of her shoulders, the curious tilt of her head. "Aiyana, he whispered. The figure on the ridge seemed to hear him, impossible, though it was across that vast distance. She raised one small hand in what might have been a greeting, then turned and disappeared back into the forest. "We have to go after her," Aiyana said, already moving toward his horse. "Wait," Helen cautioned. "If there are adults with her, they might be frightened by strangers. We need to approach this carefully." But Itzel had other ideas. The little horse was already trotting toward the eastern end of the valley, following some instinct that guided her more surely than any human plan. She paused and looked back at Aiyana, as if asking why he wasn't following. "She knows," Aiyana said, with sudden certainty. "She knows where to go." They saddled up quickly and followed Itzel across the meadow toward the forested slopes. The little horse moved with purpose, following what seemed to be an ancient trail that wound up through the pine trees. As they climbed, Aiyana's heart hammered with hope and fear in equal measure. Could it really be her? Could his daughter have survived 3 years in these mountains? And if so, what kind of life had she been living? What had she endured? After an hour of climbing, Itzel stopped in a small clearing and whinnied again. This time her call was answered by the sound of approaching footsteps through the forest. They emerged from the trees like ghosts, made solid, 5 Apache, 3 adults, and 2 children, moving with the quiet grace of people who had learned to live invisibly in the wilderness. They were thin but not starved, weathered but not broken, and they watched the approaching strangers with the cautious alertness of wild creatures. But Aiyana had eyes only for the girl who walked slightly ahead of the others. She was taller than when he had last seen her, her face more mature, her body showing the lean strength of a child who had grown up in hard country. But her eyes were the same warm brown that had looked up at him with such trust and love. 7 years before. "Aiyana," he whispered, hardly daring to believe. The girl stopped walking, her face a mask of careful control. When she spoke, Her voice was older than her years, shaped by loss and survival, and the kind of responsibility that no child should have to bear. "I know that name," she said in Apache. "It was my name once, when I was small and the world was different. My daughter," Aiyana breathed, sliding down from his horse and taking a step toward her. "My little blossom. I have searched for you for 3 years." "I know," she replied, still maintaining her distance. "We have watched you from the high places, seen you trading in the towns below. Grandmother said you were still alive, but I was not sure you would want to find me. Not want to find you." Aiyana's voice broke. "You are my heart, my breath, my reason for living. Every day since you were lost, I have looked for you." The girl's careful composure began to crack. "I am not the same child who left with you that morning," she said, tears gathering in her eyes. "I have seen terrible things, done things a child should not have to do. I am not your little blossom anymore." "You will always be my little blossom," Aiyana said, taking another step forward. "You are older, stronger, braver than before, but you are still my daughter, still the light of my life." It was Itul who broke the standoff. The little horse walked directly to the girl, lowering her head to be petted in the same gentle way she approached everyone who needed comfort. The child's hands automatically went to stroke Itul's neck, and in that simple gesture, years of careful walls began to crumble. "She remembers me," the girl whispered wonderingly. "She led me to you," Aiyana said softly. "She was born here, as you were, when she was lost and sick and dying. Something called her home, just as something called me to save her, and her to save me." The girl looked up from Itul to meet her father's eyes directly, for the first time. What she saw there, the love, the pride, the overwhelming joy of a parent reunited with his lost child, finally shattered her defenses completely. "Father," she sobbed, running into his arms at last. Aiyana caught her and held her tight, feeling the solid reality of her warm body against his chest, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the years of grief and searching and hoping finally resolve into this perfect moment of recovery. Around them, the other Apache approached slowly, and Aiyana recognized his wife's mother and sister, along with 2 other children who had been part of their extended family. They had survived together, hidden in the deepest parts of the mountains, living off the land and avoiding both soldiers and settlers for 3 long years. "We thought you might be dead," his mother-in-law said simply. "We hoped you lived, but there was no way to know." "I thought you were dead," Aiyana replied, still holding his daughter. "I searched the reservation, the settlements, everywhere I could think of. How did you survive?" "Grandmother knew the old places," Aiyana Chalina said, pulling back to look at him, but keeping her hands on his arms as if to assure herself he was real. "The hidden valleys, the secret caves, the springs that don't show on any white man's map. And we learned to be invisible." Helen had been watching this reunion with tears streaming down her face, understanding without translation the profound emotions at play. When Aiyana finally looked up and saw her, he realized he needed to make introductions. "Aiyana Chalina," he said gently. "This is Helen McKinley. She owned the ranch in this valley before the Troubles. She knew you when you were small." The girl studied Helen with the careful attention of someone who had learned to evaluate strangers quickly and accurately. "I remember," she said finally. "You had the spotted mare who liked apples, and you let me help with the new foals." "That's right," Helen said, her voice thick with emotion. "You were such a help with the horses. They trusted you more than they trusted anyone else." "She still has the gift," the grandmother said proudly. "During our time in the high places, she has gentled wild horses, healed injured animals, even communicated with the mountain cats to keep them from our camps." Aiyana looked at his daughter with new understanding. The frightened child, who had been lost 3 years ago, had grown into a young woman with remarkable skills and strength. She had not just survived, she had thrived in ways that would have been impossible in the settled world. "What will happen now?" Aiyana Chalina asked. and in her voice was the uncertainty of a child who had learned not to count on happy endings. Aiyana looked at Helen, who nodded her encouragement, then back at his daughter and her extended family. "Now," he said, "we rebuild. Helen and I are partners in restoring this ranch, making it a place where Apache and white families can live as neighbors again. There is room here for all of us if you want to stay. And if we don't?" the grandmother asked, her tone suggesting this was a test. "Then we will help you find whatever life you choose," Helen interjected firmly. "My partnership with your son-in-law is not conditional on your decisions. This is your ancestral land too. You have as much right to be here as anyone." The older woman studied Helen for a long moment, then nodded with apparent approval. "You speak with a straight tongue," she said. "That is good. There has been too much crooked speaking between our peoples." As the day wore on, the pieces of a new life began to fall into place. The Apache family would move from their hidden camps to the valley, helping to rebuild the ranch and establish new homes. Helen's workers would learn from Apache knowledge of the land, while the Apache would benefit from access to resources and legal protection that Helen's ownership provided. But it was the relationship between Aiyana and Itzel that would become the true heart of their new community. Girl and horse had found each other again across years and miles and heartbreak, and their bond would serve as a living symbol of healing and hope. That evening, as the sun set behind the western peaks and their combined families gathered around a campfire in the meadow where it had all begun, Aiyana sat with his daughter on one side, and Itzel grazing peacefully nearby. Helen sat across from them, already making plans for the spring planting and the new buildings they would need. "Father," Aiyana said quietly, "I want to tell you something." "What is it, little blossom?" "During the worst times when we were cold and hungry and afraid, I used to dream about a horse," she said. "A small horse who was lost and searching, just like we were. In my dreams, I would send her south, toward the settled lands, hoping someone would find her and care for her." Aiyana stared at his daughter, then at Itzel, understanding flooding through him, like sunlight breaking through clouds. "And in my dreams," she continued, "I told her that if she found someone with a good heart, someone who would love her, she should lead that person back to us. Because I knew that anyone kind enough to save a dying horse would be kind enough to help a lost family too." The circle was complete. The daughter had sent the horse had found the father, and the father had been led back to the daughter. What had seemed like coincidence had been connection, what had appeared random had been intentional, what had felt like loss had been the first step in a much longer journey home. As the stars emerged in the crystal-clear mountain air, Aiyana finally understood the full meaning of his dream. His daughter had indeed sent him a gift, not just the horse, but the entire chain of events that had led to this moment. The collapse in Copper Ridge's dusty street, the community that had formed around one small act of mercy, the partnership with Helen, the search that had brought them here, all of it had been orchestrated by the love between a father and daughter that had proven stronger than distance, stronger than time, stronger than all the forces that had tried to keep them apart. Itzel wandered over as if drawn by his thoughts, nuzzling his shoulder with the gentle affection that had first captured his heart months ago. But now he understood that her love had never been random either. She had recognized him from the very beginning as the father of the girl who had loved her first. "Thank you," he whispered to her, stroking her neck as tears of gratitude ran down his weathered cheeks. "Thank you for leading me home." As the fire burned low and their new family settled down for the night under stars that seemed close enough to touch, none of them could have imagined how their story would ripple outward in the years to come. The ranch they would rebuild would become a model for cooperation between Apache and white settlers. The techniques they would develop for healing traumatized animals would spread throughout the territory. The children who would grow up there, both Apache and white, would carry forward a different vision of what it meant to be neighbors in a harsh and beautiful land. But all of that was still in the future. Tonight there was only the simple miracle of family reunited, of love that had endured across impossible odds, of a skinny, mangy Mustang Foal who had collapsed in the dust, and somehow managed to heal not just herself, but everyone whose lives she touched. In the morning they would begin the work of building their new life together. But tonight they were complete, father and daughter, woman and horse, broken hearts made whole again by the kind of love that transforms not just individuals, but entire communities, entire ways of seeing the world. The Apache's next move had indeed shocked the whole town of Copper Ridge. But more than that, it had shown all of them, that sometimes the most profound acts of courage come not from fighting, but from the simple decision to care for something smaller and more vulnerable than yourself. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that simple act of care comes back to you multiplied 100-fold, in ways you never could have imagined. As Aiyana drifted off to sleep with his daughter safe beside him and Enzel standing guard nearby, he knew that the long journey was finally over. They were home at last. Not just in a place, but in the love that connects all living things, when hearts are brave enough to remain open even after they've been broken. The circle was complete. The healing was done. The family was whole. And in the morning, the real adventure would begin.